The sound of heavy machinery tore through the morning air as I watched 83 luxury condominiums crumble to dust. Sheriff Karen Rodriguez stood beside me in handcuffs, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. The federal marshals had just read her rights for corruption, racketeering, and civil rights violations. As the final explosion echoed across my grandfather's stolen land, I turned to her and said the words I had been waiting months to speak. You should have known better than to steal from someone who owns a demolition company. The funeral director handed me the keys to my grandfather's property on a cold October morning. 200 acres of prime lakefront land in Pine Ridge County, hidden away in the mountains where cell service barely reached, and the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a gravel road. I had visited as a child, but never understood the true scope of what Grandpa Joe owned. I drove my truck through the rusted gate for the first time as the legal owner. The main house sat on a hill overlooking the valley, but the real treasure lay in the eastern section, where the land stretched down to Crystal Lake. According to the surveyor maps tucked in my glove compartment, my property line extended nearly a mile beyond what I could see from the main road. The morning mist hung low over the pine trees as I walked the boundaries with GPS coordinates and old fence posts as my guide. This was more than just land. This was generational wealth that my grandfather had quietly accumulated over 50 years of careful purchases and tax sales. The soil was rich, the water rights were included, and the lakefront access alone was worth millions in today's market. But something was wrong. As I crested the ridge on the far eastern boundary, the sound of construction equipment cut through the peaceful silence. Bulldozers and concrete trucks moved like yellow ants across what should have been untouched forest. I pulled out my phone and checked the GPS coordinates twice. There was no mistake. The construction was happening entirely on my land. I was still staring at the chaos below when the sheriff's cruiser pulled up behind my truck. A woman in her 40s stepped out, adjusting her duty belt with the confidence of someone who expected immediate respect. Her badge read K. Rodriguez, and her smile was too wide for the circumstances. "You must be Joe's grandson," she said, extending her hand. "I am Sheriff Karen Rodriguez. I heard you were in town for the funeral. Sorry for your loss." I shook her hand, but my eyes kept drifting toward the construction noise. "Thank you, Sheriff. Can you tell me what is happening down there? That activity is on my property." Karen followed my gaze and shrugged. "Oh, that old mess. There has been some confusion about property lines in this area for years. I would not worry about it too much. These things have a way of working themselves out through the proper legal channels." Her dismissive tone sent a chill down my spine. This was not confusion. This was deliberate construction on private land, and the sheriff was acting like it was perfectly normal. "I have the deed and survey maps right here," I said, pulling the documents from my truck. "This is definitely my land." Karen barely glanced at the papers. Property disputes can get complicated, especially with old boundaries. You might want to talk to a lawyer before you get too worked up about it. Sometimes what looks clear on paper is not so simple in reality. She climbed back into her cruiser but rolled down the window before driving away. "Welcome to Pine Ridge County. I hope you decide to stick around. We could use more reasonable people in this community." The way she emphasized reasonable felt like a warning. I returned the next morning with Jake Morrison, a certified surveyor who had worked in the county for 20 years. We spent 3 hours walking the property lines with GPS equipment, measuring distances, and confirming every boundary marker. The results were undeniable. The entire construction project sat squarely on my land, not even close to any disputed boundary. 83 luxury condominiums in various stages of completion, foundation work for dozens more, access roads carved through old-growth forest that had stood for centuries, a temporary sales office with glossy brochures advertising lakefront living at Crystal Shores Resort Community. This is one of the biggest unauthorized construction projects I have ever seen, Jake said, shaking his head. Whoever is behind this invested serious money without bothering to verify they actually own the land. I took photos and videos from every angle, documenting the scope of the violation. The condos were not cheap prefab units. These were high-end constructions with granite countertops, hardwood floors, and private balconies overlooking my lake. Someone had planned to make millions selling these units to wealthy buyers looking for mountain getaways. The construction crew noticed us approaching, and several workers began packing up their tools. A foreman in a hard hat walked over, clearly nervous about our presence. "You folks need to move along," he said. "This is private property and we have deadlines to meet." "It is private property," I replied. "It is my private property. Do you have any permits or documentation showing you have permission to build here?" The foreman looked confused and pulled out his phone. Within minutes, Sheriff Karen arrived in her cruiser, responding faster than seemed possible for a rural area with limited patrol coverage. "Having trouble again?" she asked, directing the question at me rather than the foreman. "No trouble at all," I said. "Just documenting the unauthorized construction on my land before I contact my attorney." Karen smiled, but her eyes were cold. Actually, there might be some confusion about that. She reached into her cruiser and pulled out a manila folder. "I have documentation here showing this land belongs to Pine Ridge Development Corporation. They purchased it from the county last year for unpaid taxes." My blood ran cold. "That is impossible. My grandfather paid his taxes every year. I have the receipts going back decades." "Well, records can be complicated," Karen said, handing me a sheet of paper. "This shows a lien was placed on the property for environmental violations and unpaid fines. When the liens were not satisfied, the county was forced to auction the land." The document looked official, complete with county seals and signatures. But something felt wrong about the dates and the formatting. I had never seen anything like this in my grandfather's meticulously organized paperwork. "I want to see the original sale records," I said. Karen shook her head. "Those documents are sealed pending ongoing legal proceedings. Pine Ridge Development is dealing with some federal regulatory issues, so everything related to their land acquisitions is confidential right now." "Federal regulatory issues?" I asked. "Nothing you need to worry about," Karen said. "But I would strongly advise you to let the professionals handle this. Property disputes can get messy, and sometimes people who push too hard end up in more trouble than they bargained for." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Karen was telling me to walk away or face consequences. I looked at Jake, who was studying the documents with a frown. He caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Something was not right about the paperwork, but this was not the time or place to challenge it. "I appreciate the information, Sheriff," I said. "I will definitely be consulting with my attorney about this matter." "You do that," Karen replied. "And I would recommend staying off this property until the legal issues are resolved. Trespassing charges can be expensive and time-consuming to fight." As we drove away, Jake was quiet for several miles before finally speaking. "Those documents are fake. The formatting is wrong. The signatures do not match county standards, and the timeline does not make sense. Your grandfather never had environmental violations or unpaid taxes. So what do? I asked. We go to the courthouse and pull the real records, and we do it before Sheriff Corinne realizes how much trouble she is in. The Pine Ridge County Courthouse was a tired brick building that had served the community since 1952. Mrs. Henderson, the records clerk, had worked there for 37 years and knew every filing cabinet like an old friend. She was a small woman with silver hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. "I remember your grandfather," she said when I introduced myself. "Joe was a good man, always paid his taxes on time and never caused any trouble." I explained what I had discovered on the property and showed her the documents Corinne had provided. Mrs. Henderson examined them carefully, her frown deepening with each page. "These are not our documents," she whispered, glancing toward the door. "The format is all wrong, and we have never used this type of seal. Someone created these to look official." She led me to the back filing room where decades of property records were stored in metal cabinets. The real records showed a completely different story. My grandfather had indeed paid his taxes faithfully every year. There were no environmental violations, no liens, and no tax sale. The land had been legally transferred to me through his will with no outstanding debts or disputes. "Mrs. Henderson," I said quietly, "have you noticed anything unusual happening with property records lately? Any after-hours access or missing files?" She looked around nervously before answering. "Sheriff Rodriguez has been coming in after hours quite frequently over the past year. She claims to be researching old cases, but she always goes straight to the property records section. Last month, I found several files had been removed and returned with different documents inside." My heart was racing. Different documents. Yes, original deeds replaced with newer versions. Tax records altered to show different payment histories. I wanted to report it, but she trailed off, fear evident in her voice. "But you were afraid," I finished for her. Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Sheriff Rodriguez has a lot of power in this county. People who cross her tend to have problems. Business licenses get revoked, permits get denied, and sometimes they get arrested for things that do not make sense." I spent the next 2 hours copying every document related to my property. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone had systematically falsified records to make it appear that my land was available for purchase, then created fake documentation showing Pine Ridge Development Corporation as the legal owner. The corporation itself was interesting. A quick search showed it was owned by Rodriguez Holdings, LLC, which was registered to Miguel Rodriguez at an address in the next county, Sheriff Corinne's husband. But the corruption went deeper than family business deals. I found records showing that Corinne had personally signed off on all the construction permits for the Condo project. She had approved the environmental impact studies, waived the public notice requirements, and fast-tracked every aspect of the development process. The most damning evidence came in a file labeled "Complaints Unresolved." Inside were 6 handwritten letters from my grandfather, all addressed to Sheriff Rodriguez, all dated within the last year of his life. He had discovered the trespassing and construction activity. He had demanded action. He had threatened to contact federal authorities if the illegal building did not stop. The final letter was dated just 2 weeks before his death. "Sheriff Rodriguez," it read, "I know what you are doing to steal my land. I have documented evidence of your corruption, and I will not let you destroy my family's legacy. If you do not stop this immediately, I will take this matter to the FBI." There was no record of any response from Corinne's office, no investigation, no follow-up. My grandfather had died knowing his land was being stolen, but feeling powerless to stop it. Mrs. Henderson made copies of everything while I sat in stunned silence. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to stop her," I said, "whatever it takes." "Be careful," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Karen Rodriguez is not just corrupt. She is dangerous. People who threaten her have a way of disappearing or having accidents." I walked out of the courthouse with a folder full of evidence and a growing understanding that I was not just fighting a property dispute. I was taking on an entire network of corruption that reached into every corner of Pine Ridge County government. And they had already killed once to protect their secret. I arrived at the construction site the next morning with my attorney, David Chen, and a folder full of evidence that could put Sheriff Karen in prison for decades. David was a sharp young lawyer from the state capital who specialized in government corruption cases. He had driven 3 hours to meet me after I explained the situation over the phone. "This is one of the most blatant cases of official corruption I have ever seen," he said as we reviewed the documents. "We have falsified records, abuse of office, conspiracy, and possibly murder if your grandfather's death was not natural." We parked at the construction entrance and walked directly to the foreman's trailer. I wanted this confrontation to be public, with witnesses and documentation. David had his recording equipment ready, and I had my phone camera rolling. Sheriff Karen arrived within 5 minutes of our appearance, as if she had been watching the site. But this time, she was not alone. 3 deputies climbed out of 2 additional patrol cars, and their body language was aggressive rather than professional. "You are trespassing on private property," Karen announced before we could speak. "I am ordering you to leave immediately." "This is my property," I replied, holding up the deed. "And I have documentation proving that your development permits are based on falsified records." David stepped forward and identified himself as my attorney. "Sheriff Rodriguez, we have evidence of systematic corruption in your office, including forged documents and abuse of your official position for personal financial gain." Karen's face darkened. "You are interfering with an ongoing law enforcement investigation. I am placing both of you under arrest for obstruction of justice and criminal trespass." "On what grounds?" David demanded. "We are on private property owned by my client, and we have not interfered with any legitimate law enforcement activity." "The grounds are that I am the sheriff and I say you are under arrest," Karen snapped. 2 deputies moved to flank us, while the third began taking photos with his phone. I realized they were documenting the scene to support whatever false charges they planned to file. "You cannot arrest us for exercising our legal rights," I said, but my voice was shaking. The 3 deputies were large men with their hands resting on their weapons. We were outnumbered and isolated, with no witnesses except the construction crew who clearly worked for Karen's operation. "Watch me," Karen said, pulling out her handcuffs. David tried to intervene. "Sheriff Rodriguez, I am recording this interaction, and I will file federal civil rights complaints if you proceed with this unlawful arrest." Karen snatched his recording device and smashed it on the ground. "Oops," she said with a cold smile. "Equipment malfunction." Then she grabbed my phone and deleted all the photos and videos I had taken. These devices contained sensitive information related to an ongoing investigation, she announced loudly for the benefit of her deputies. They had to be secured for public safety. I felt completely helpless as Karen slapped the handcuffs on my wrists. The metal was cold and tight, and the deputies were positioning themselves to make the arrest look justified for any security cameras. "You are making a huge mistake," David warned. "I have copies of all our evidence in multiple locations. Arresting us will only make the federal charges against you more serious." Corinne ignored him and pushed me toward her patrol car. "You should have listened when I told you to stay away from this property. Now you are going to learn what happens to people who do not know when to mind their own business." As she shoved me into the back seat, I heard her talking quietly to one of her deputies. "Make sure word gets around town that these outsiders were trying to steal local land with fake documents. I want everyone to know they are troublemakers who cannot be trusted." The ride to the county jail took 20 minutes, and Corinne used every minute to paint me as a dangerous outsider who was trying to defraud honest local business people. She claimed I had forged my grandfather's will, falsified property records, and threatened construction workers with violence. "Your grandfather was a bitter old man who caused problems for everyone," she said, watching me in the rearview mirror. "He died owing money all over the county, and now you are trying to profit from his debts. But this is a small community where people look out for each other. We do not let outsiders come in and steal from hardworking families." By the time we reached the jail, Corinne had constructed an entire false narrative about my motives and actions. I was no longer a property owner defending his legal rights. I was a con artist trying to steal land from honest developers. The booking process took 4 hours, during which time Corinne filed a restraining order barring me from my own property. When David finally got me released on bond, he was furious. "She just made the biggest mistake of her career," he said. "False arrest, evidence tampering, civil rights violations. We have enough to put her away for decades." But as we walked out of the courthouse, I realized that Corinne had accomplished something important. She had turned me from an unknown threat into a public enemy. By the time we reached my truck, there were already 3 messages on my phone from local businesses canceling services and asking me to stay away from their establishments. Corinne Rodriguez controlled more than just the law in Pine Ridge County. She controlled the narrative. David and I drove directly from the courthouse to a diner in the next county, where we could talk freely without worrying about Corinne's network of informants. Over coffee and sandwiches, we planned our counterattack against the most corrupt sheriff either of us had ever encountered. "The good news is that she overplayed her hand," David explained. "False arrest, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations are federal crimes. The bad news is that she controls the local law enforcement and most of the county government. We need outside help." That evening, I called my Uncle Pete in Nevada. Pete was my grandfather's younger brother, a tough old rancher who had spent 40 years fighting government corruption and corporate land grabs. More importantly, he owned Morrison Demolition Company, the business I had inherited along with the land. "Your grandfather called me 3 weeks before he died," Pete told me over the phone. "He said Sheriff Rodriguez was stealing his land and he was afraid for his life. I told him to fight back, but Joe was tired and sick. He said he was counting on you to finish what he started." "What do you mean, finish what he started?" I asked. Pete was quiet for a long moment. "Joe was not just a landowner, nephew. He was a demolition expert who spent 30 years bringing down corrupt buildings and crooked developments. He taught me everything I know about explosives, heavy machinery, and the fine art of controlled destruction." My heart started racing. "Are you saying—" "I am saying that Morrison Demolition has all the equipment, expertise, and legal authority to remove unauthorized structures from private property. And I am saying that your grandfather left you more than just land. He left you the tools to fight back." Pete arrived in Pine Ridge County 3 days later with a convoy of trucks carrying excavators, bulldozers, and enough demolition equipment to level a city block. He also brought something even more valuable: Judge Patricia Williams, a retired federal judge who had spent 20 years prosecuting public corruption cases. Judge Williams was a small woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of corruption imaginable. She reviewed our evidence for 2 hours before rendering her verdict. "Sheriff Rodriguez is going to federal prison," she said simply. "The only question is whether she takes down the rest of the county government with her." But Judge Williams also brought a warning. "This case is bigger than one corrupt sheriff. Rodriguez is connected to a network that includes state politicians, federal contractors, and organized crime figures. When you move against her, they will move against you." "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Total war," she replied. "Hit them so hard and so publicly that they cannot respond without exposing themselves. Make the corruption so obvious that federal authorities have no choice but to intervene." Over the next week, we assembled our team. Pete brought demolition experts and heavy equipment operators. Judge Williams provided legal expertise and federal contacts. David handled the media strategy and civil rights documentation. Mrs. Henderson from the courthouse agreed to testify about the falsified records. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would force a public confrontation that would expose Corinne's corruption to the entire community and make federal intervention inevitable. The demolition company would provide the perfect cover for our real objective: bringing down Corinne Rodriguez and her criminal network. "Are you ready for this?" Pete asked me on the night before we launched our operation. "Once we start, there is no going back. Corinne will try to destroy you, and she has the power to make your life miserable." I thought about my grandfather, dying while his land was being stolen. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, afraid to report corruption because of Corinne's threats. I thought about all the other victims of Corinne's abuse who had been too scared or powerless to fight back. "I am ready," I said. "Let us bring her down." The social media campaign launched at exactly 6:00 a.m. on a Monday morning. David had prepared a comprehensive package of evidence including photos, documents, video testimony, and a detailed timeline of Corinne's corruption. Within hours, the story was spreading across Facebook, Twitter, and local community groups faster than Corinne could contain it. The post was simple but devastating. "Sheriff Corinne Rodriguez stole my grandfather's land and built 83 illegal condominiums. Here is the proof." The evidence spoke for itself. Side-by-side photo showing falsified documents next to the originals. Video testimony from Mrs. Henderson explaining how records had been altered. Financial documents proving the connection between Corinne's family and the development company. Most damaging of all, copies of my grandfather's letters begging Corinne to stop the illegal construction. By noon, the story had been shared over 2,000 times. Local residents began commenting with their own stories of Corinne's abuse of power. A restaurant owner described how Corinne had threatened to shut down his business unless he paid protection money. A single mother explained how Corinne had her arrested on false charges after she refused to sell her property below market value. The Pine Ridge County Facebook group exploded with outrage and long-suppressed grievances. People who had been afraid to speak out individually found courage in numbers. The comments section became a digital town hall where citizens finally felt safe to share their experiences with Corinne's corruption. Corinne tried to fight back with her own social media posts, claiming I was spreading lies and trying to steal land from hardworking families. But her responses only made things worse. Each denial was met with additional evidence and more victim testimonies. Her supporters quickly realized they were defending the indefensible. The story reached the local television station by Tuesday afternoon. Reporter Sarah Martinez had been investigating rumors about corruption in Pine Ridge County for months, but had been unable to find witnesses willing to go on record. Now she had a folder full of documented evidence and dozens of victims ready to speak publicly. The evening news segment was devastating. Sarah interviewed me at the construction site, with the illegal condominiums clearly visible in the background. She spoke with Mrs. Henderson about the falsified records. Most powerfully, she interviewed 3 other property owners who had been targeted by Corinne's land grab schemes. "This is not an isolated incident," Sarah reported. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence of a systematic pattern of corruption involving Sheriff Rodriguez, her family members, and several county officials. The FBI has confirmed they are reviewing our findings." Corinne held a press conference the next day, flanked by her remaining supporters and a lawyer who looked extremely uncomfortable. She claimed to be the victim of a coordinated attack by outside agitators who wanted to destroy Pine Ridge County's economic development. "These people are not from our community," Corinne declared. "They do not understand our values or our commitment to growth and prosperity. They want to stop progress and keep our county poor and underdeveloped." But her press conference backfired spectacularly when a reporter asked about the falsified documents. Corinne's lawyer immediately ended the event, but not before Corinne made several statements that contradicted her previous claims and raised additional questions about her involvement. The real breakthrough came on Thursday when FBI agent Jennifer Park arrived in Pine Ridge County with a team of federal investigators. Agent Park was a specialist in public corruption cases who had successfully prosecuted dozens of crooked officials across the country. "We have been monitoring the situation in Pine Ridge County for several months," Agent Park announced at her own press conference. "The evidence provided by concerned citizens has given us probable cause to open a formal investigation into corruption, civil rights violations, and possible racketeering activity." The federal investigation transformed everything. What had started as my personal fight to reclaim stolen land had become a federal case with national implications. News crews arrived from 3 major cities. The story made headlines in newspapers across the state. Corinne Rodriguez was no longer a powerful local sheriff. She was a federal suspect whose corruption had been exposed to the entire country. But the most satisfying moment came Friday evening when I received a phone call from Mrs. Henderson. "They arrested Corinne's husband this afternoon," she whispered. "The FBI raided his construction company and seized all the financial records. Word is spreading that several county commissioners are also under investigation." Corinne's network of corruption was collapsing. The federal spotlight had made it impossible for her co-conspirators to continue protecting each other. One by one, they were abandoning Corinne to save themselves. "How are you holding up?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "I am ready for the final phase," I replied. "Tomorrow we take back the land." The federal court order arrived at 6:00 a.m. on Saturday morning, delivered by U.S. Marshal Thomas Richardson and a team of 6 armed deputies. The injunction was sweeping and absolute. All construction must stop immediately, all personnel must vacate the premises, and the rightful property owner was authorized to take whatever steps necessary to secure his land. More importantly, the court had issued a demolition permit allowing me to remove all unauthorized structures at the county's expense. Corinne's illegal condominiums would be torn down within 48 hours, and the cost would be recovered from the seized assets of her criminal enterprise. I arrived at the construction site with Uncle Pete and 4 demolition crews at sunrise. The convoy of trucks stretched for half a mile: excavators, bulldozers, dump trucks, and specialized demolition equipment. We also brought something Karen would never expect: live streaming equipment that would broadcast the entire demolition to thousands of viewers online. The construction workers had already abandoned the site, leaving behind their tools and unfinished work. The condominium stood empty and silent, expensive monuments to Karen's greed and arrogance. Each unit represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen value, built on land that never belonged to the criminals who profited from its development. Karen arrived with her 3 remaining loyal deputies at 7:30 a.m., just as we were setting up the first explosive charges. She was no longer the confident authority figure who had threatened me months earlier. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair was unkempt, and her eyes showed the strain of someone whose world was collapsing. "You cannot do this," she demanded, approaching Marshal Richardson. "This is county property and you have no jurisdiction here." Marshal Richardson handed her a copy of the federal court order. "Ma'am, you need to read this carefully. A federal judge has determined that this construction was conducted illegally on private property. The rightful owner has been authorized to remove all unauthorized structures." Karen read the document with growing desperation. "This is a mistake. The land belongs to Pine Ridge Development Corporation. I have documentation proving legal ownership." "Ma'am, those documents have been determined to be fraudulent," the marshal replied. "You need to move your vehicles back to the road and allow the demolition to proceed." I positioned myself where Karen could see me clearly and started the live stream. Within minutes, over 1,000 viewers were watching as Uncle Pete's crew prepared the first building for controlled demolition. "This is what justice looks like," I said to the camera. 83 illegal condominiums built on stolen land are about to be reduced to rubble. Sheriff Karen Rodriguez thought she could steal my grandfather's legacy, but she forgot one important detail: I own a demolition company. The first explosion was beautiful. The northeast corner building, a 3-story luxury unit with granite countertops and hardwood floors, collapsed in a perfect controlled implosion. Dust and debris rose in a symmetrical cloud as thousands of dollars in stolen construction crumbled to the ground. Karen screamed, "Stop!" but her voice was lost in the thunder of falling concrete and twisted steel. The live stream viewers exploded with comments and reactions. People were sharing the video across social media platforms, celebrating the destruction of corruption in real time. Local residents who had been victimized by Karen's abuse of power were finally seeing justice served in the most visible way possible. Uncle Pete coordinated the demolition with military precision. Each building fell exactly on schedule, with perfect safety protocols and maximum visual impact. The live stream audience grew to over 10,000 viewers as word spread about the spectacular destruction. But the most satisfying moment came during the demolition of building number 47. As the structure collapsed, we discovered hidden compartments containing financial records, offshore banking documents, and evidence of money laundering that Karen had tried to conceal in the construction. "Well, well," said FBI Agent Park, who had arrived to observe the demolition. "Looks like we just found evidence of additional federal crimes." Karen watched in horror as her criminal empire literally crumbled around her. Each falling building represented years of careful planning and corruption being destroyed in seconds. The money she had stolen, the lives she had ruined, the community she had betrayed, it was all being reduced to dust and rubble. At 4:30 p.m., as the final condominium collapsed in a cloud of dust and justice, Agent Park approached Karen with handcuffs. Karen Rodriguez, you are under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, civil rights violations, money laundering, and corruption of public office. The live stream captured every moment as Karen was led away in handcuffs. Her criminal empire nothing but rubble, and her reign of terror finally ended. Over 15,000 people watched online as justice was finally served in Pine Ridge County. The federal trial lasted 3 weeks and made headlines across the country. Karen Rodriguez's corruption was so extensive that prosecutors needed dozens of witnesses and hundreds of exhibits to present their case. The evidence was overwhelming: falsified documents, stolen land, money laundering, civil rights violations, and a conspiracy that had lasted over 5 years. Karen's defense attorney tried to portray her as a dedicated public servant who had made mistakes while trying to promote economic development. But the evidence spoke louder than any closing argument. Mrs. Henderson testified about the falsified records. 3 property owners described how Karen had stolen their land. Federal agents explained the money laundering scheme that had funneled millions of dollars through offshore accounts. Most damaging of all was the testimony from Karen's own former deputies, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. They described a culture of corruption where Karen sold protection to drug dealers, extorted money from businesses, and used her badge to intimidate anyone who challenged her authority. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Patricia Williams, now serving as a federal prosecutor, asked for the maximum sentence. Karen Rodriguez used her position of trust to terrorize the citizens she was sworn to protect, Judge Williams told the court. She stole land, destroyed lives, and corrupted the very foundations of justice in Pine Ridge County. The sentence must reflect the severity of her crimes and the damage she caused to her community. Karen received 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Her husband Miguel received 10 years for money laundering and conspiracy. 3 county commissioners received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years for their roles in the corruption scheme. The financial recovery was equally satisfying. Federal agents had seized over $12 million in assets from Karen's criminal network, including bank accounts, real estate, and luxury vehicles. The court ordered full restitution to all victims, with the remaining funds used to restore the damaged land and compensate the community for Karen's abuse of office. I used my portion of the settlement to restore my grandfather's land to its natural state. Environmental experts removed all traces of the illegal construction and replanted native vegetation around Crystal Lake. Within 2 years, wildlife had returned to the area, and the scars of Karen's greed had been erased by nature's healing power. The memorial garden I built for my grandfather sits on the ridge overlooking the lake, surrounded by wildflowers and ancient oak trees. A simple stone marker reads, "Joe Morrison, he taught us that justice is worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the corruption." Pine Ridge County elected a new sheriff who ran on a platform of transparency and accountability. The county government implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future corruption. Most importantly, the community learned that citizens have the power to fight back against abuse of authority, even when that authority seems untouchable. 3 years later, I still own the Demolition company and the 200 acres of pristine lakefront property. But the real victory was not about land or money. It was about proving that justice can prevail against corruption when ordinary people find the courage to fight back. Karen Rodriguez thought she could steal my grandfather's legacy. Instead, she helped me discover mine.